All right, so we're going to get started with this kind of tour of the anatomy of the brain by looking at the neuron, which is the smallest component that we're going to look at of our neural anatomy. And so, what you're going to see here is we're going to talk about how nerve cells communicate with one another, and you're even going to see a couple of diagrams here that you're going to have to replicate for me. I'm going to talk to you about a couple of parts of the brain. On your brain quiz, you're going to have to label these parts of the neurons and be able to tell me what it is that they do. If you take a look here, this is a basic structure of a neuron. You've got billions and billions of these in your body. Basically, there are two types of cells that make up the nervous system. We're going to look at the neuron. If you got a little more into the cellular biology, you might look at glial cells. That's a little more specific than what we're going to get. This, though, is the neuron. And like I said, you've got billions of these. Listening to the sound of my voice, looking at what's on the screen, typing on your keyboard, all of those functions, all of those things are controlled by the firing of neurons. And so I want to call your attention to a couple of different parts of the diagram in front of you. If you look at the top left-hand corner, you see the word dendrite. And dendrites are the branches that you see there coming into the neuron. When a neuron receives a signal, that signal comes in through the dendrite. So everything that's coming in that's activating that neuron is coming in through those dendrites. It's going to come to the dendrites as a chemical signal. And that chemical signal is going to decide whether or not the nucleus, that little green kind of P-shaped thing you see in the middle, whether the nucleus is going to be activated or whether it's going to be inhibited. So whether it's going to send that signal on to the next neuron in the chain or if it's going to start to quiet down what's going on inside of the cell. So that signal's coming into the dendrite. It hits the nucleus. The nucleus then is going to either fire or not fire. And as you can see, there's that long kind of yellow sheath of what is called the myelin sheath. Basically, that's a layer of protective fat that's coming around what's called the axon of the nerve. Axon is the part of the nerve that's going to carry a signal away from the nucleus. The way I like to remember that is by remembering that away starts with an A, and so does the axon. Well, as that signal goes away, it's an electrical signal that's going to come from the nucleus down the axon, and what's protecting that is the myelin sheath. So you kind of think of it like the insulation around a wire that's helping that signal to be strong as it's going through. If stuff starts to happen to that myelin sheath, age can do it, disease can do it, drug use can do it, damage that myelin sheath. It's usually pretty easy to see when somebody's got damage to the myelin sheath. They're not able to control body movements as well, be a little jerky and different things, and so that can tell you that the myelin sheath has been affected. There's also a theory out there. I was just reading a paper this summer that was talking about thinking that maybe thinner myelin sheaths were a sign of autism in children, and that may be responsible for some of the symptoms we see of people who are on the spectrum. And so the signal is going to come in through the dendrites, it's going to hit that nucleus. If the nucleus says, yeah, I need to send this on, that signal is going to go down the myelin sheath on the axon to those axon terminals. And when it hits those axon terminals, what is right next to it are the dendrites of the next neuron. So let me flip this picture up for you here. You can see both those neurons that are together. So for my intents and purposes, you need to know what a dendrite is, a nucleus is, what an axon is, and what the myelin sheath is. So those are the four things that you're going to have to label for me on the brain quiz. And you can see that the axons of one nerve are pretty much touching or very, very close to touching the dendrites of the next one. And so, like I said, this happens in a chain as those neurons are going on. Now, what's going to happen is they aren't touching. They look like they're touching, but there's a space in between that is known as a synapse. And the synapse is where an awful lot of the important function that we're going to be talking about as we start to talk about psychological disorders and drugs and things like that. It's a lot of where that is going to happen. What you've got, and I put up a picture here for you of kind of that microscopic space. So coming down from the top, you've got the end of the axon of one cell, and that stuff on the bottom right, that's the dendrite of the next neuron. You can see there's just that real narrow space in between those two. Now what happens is that signal is going to travel along the axon. When it hits the synapse, you can see those little purple sacs. Those are called vesicles. And vesicles have neurotransmitters in them. And there are all kinds of different neurotransmitters. You've actually got an activity you're going to do for me where you look at the different types of neurotransmitters and what they do. But these are things that you may have heard of, like serotonin or GABA or norepinephrine. There's a bunch of different things that can be there. And sometimes neurons have just one type. Sometimes vesicles have just one type, or sometimes there are a couple of different types of neurotransmitters. But that signal that's coming from the axon is what's going to tell the vesicles what to release. So those neurotransmitters, those little black dots that you see in that white space, are going to cross the synaptic space, and then they're going to touch or the receptors on the dendrites of the next neuron. And so that's going to keep the signal going. So those neurotransmitters that are coming over are going to say, hey, we need you guys in the next neuron to get your act together and send this signal on, or we need you in the next neuron to calm down, to stop sending signals if that's what that particular impulse is telling them. So this synaptic space is really important because those neurotransmitters are what are sending those signals. And you can have too much of a neurotransmitter and that be a problem. You can have too little of a neurotransmitter, or we can have things that are synthetic, like man-made neurotransmitters that can mess with that. Sometimes drugs can mess with what's going on there in the synaptic space, and it can cause all kinds of different things to start to happen. I'm going to close up here with a little kind of animation to give you an idea of what this process may look like. So check this out.
Communication between two neurons begins when an electrical impulse called an action potential travels along the axon of a presynaptic neuron toward the axon terminal. The action potential cannot cross the synaptic space. When it reaches the axon terminal, it causes membranous sacs called vesicles to move toward the membrane of the axon terminal. The membrane of the vesicle fuses with the membrane of the axon terminal, enabling the vesicle to release its contents into the synaptic space. The molecules released from the vesicles are chemicals called neurotransmitters. They drift across the synaptic space and bind to special proteins called receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. The binding of a neurotransmitter to its receptor can trigger an action potential in the postsynaptic neuron. That electrical signal then moves toward the cell body of the postsynaptic neuron. Now that the neurotransmitter has relayed its message, it releases from the receptor into the synaptic space. Some of the neurotransmitter is degraded by enzymes in the synaptic space, and some of the neurotransmitter is carried back into the presynaptic neuron through transporter proteins. The neurotransmitter that is taken back up into the presynaptic neuron is then repackaged into vesicles that can be released the next time an action potential reaches the axon terminal. The entire process repeats each time an action potential reaches the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron.
And so that process, as complicated as that seems, is going on millions of times every second inside your brain. Now the cool thing is, the more we do something, so if you were in band or sport or something like that where you kind of repeat the same movements or motions, is that those neurons get used to doing that. and so the transmission's a little smoother. But that all that complicated stuff is happening in just about everything that you do. And so it's important to take a look at that kind of as we're getting started with this basic understanding of neuroanatomy.